Look here, I be on the paper chase. I'm all about my cheddar. I ain't touching the mic if it ain't 5 G's or better. I plan to never fall short. Again, I won't gain. Woody, I'ma tell you, no pain, no gain. I hustle hard for what I want, that's how I get it. I struggle hard, and if it's out there, I'm gon' get it. If you see CMR, a $sign on the CD, somewhere on there you'll see featuring the BG. Me and my nigga V, like Suge and Pop, we getting our shine on all the way to the top. Look, ain't no stopping us, boy, don't try. When you hear once, it ain't no secret you going by. You could lie about this, stunt about that. You can't die these 50 shots, I'm about the red tat-tat. Ain't nothing changed, still a bust a wig splitter. Straight hustle for my cheese, I'm a money go get about my paper, my cheese. So before my eyes close, I want my greens to add up to 6 zeros. Get your betty nigga, somebody play a hate split 'em. Get your betty nigga, somebody play a hate kill 'em. I'm about my paper, my cheese. So before my eyes close, I want my greens to add up to 6 zeros. Get your betty nigga, somebody play a hate split 'em. Get your betty nigga, somebody play a hate kill 'em. It's all about Benjamins, that's all I wanna have. Ducked off in my house with a hoe taking a bubble bath. Sparkling marble, covering all my room floors. A maid in a bathing suit doing my house chores. Do not disturb sign on my bedroom door, cause my dick getting ate by my #1 whore. Look, I'm money hungry, about acting a donkey. No longer a junkie, I got rid of that monkey. I'm cheeky, I don't want you fucking with my shit. My neck and my knuckles covered with crushed out shit. Sparkling gold cover my motherfucking grill. Pockets filled with big head $100 bills. Fucking up this rap game with these wicked rap skills. And ain't far from making G's to making meals. I'm a trill BG, uptown hard hitter. On the real, my nigga, I'm a money go getter. About my paper, my cheese. So before my eyes close, I want my greens to add up to 6 zeros. Get your betty nigga, somebody play a hate split 'em. Get your betty nigga, somebody play a hate kill 'em. About my paper, my cheese. So before my eyes close, I want my greens to add up to 6 zeros. Get your betty nigga, somebody play a hate split 'em. And get your betty nigga, somebody try to stop you, kill 'em. Oh, I gotta get it, gotta grab it, gotta have it. Like snorting dope or snorting coke, it's a habit. I gotta see it, gotta feel it, quick to spin it. Shoot dice all day with my niggas trying to win it. I rap hustle, cause I'm a hustling ass nigga. Also a get told about busting some ass nigga. So you come play with me, about my cheese, you gotta go fool. In the casket, 6 BDs, selling tapes and CDs, like selling pick 3s. Ring up a million sales, we didn't hit the lottery. I'm a Benjamin chaser, player hater eraser. Police have no case, cause I do murders without a trace. I'm almost at home, I didn't pass third base. I'm playing with 5 figures, but when I get 6, I'm straight. If I catch your bitch down bad, I'ma hit her. Paper chasing nigga, BG, a money go get her. About my paper, my cheese. So before my eyes close, I want my greens to add up to 6 zeros. Get your betty nigga, somebody play a hate split 'em. Get your betty nigga, somebody try to stop you, kill 'em. I'm about my paper, my cheese. So before my eyes close, I want my greens to add up to 6 zeros. Get your betty nigga, somebody play.
Yo, let's see if y'all can hear me. Can y'all hear me? Can y'all hear me? All right, good. I don't know what happened to the audio track. It just dropped out. But yeah, we here, man. You know we bought our paper. We bought our paper, we bought our cheese. So before my eyes close, I'm trying to make my bank account count to 6 zeros. But we here, man. 7 gang, Source Gang over everything. Y'all know how we rocking, man. Source Gang in the building. We back. And today was a day, man. We had the debate or whatever, debate a log or whatever between my brother Avery versus Jungle Jargon. So they got it in. We came on here for 4 hours and impromptu. And we had an exchange of ideas. Our ideas were tested. That's what it's all about, trying to get them ideas tested. But I want to get back on track here with the program. Today, we're going to be dealing with the Ashkenazic Jews and biblical Israelites. A lot of Black Hebrew Israelites don't like the Ashkenazic Jews. A lot of them have a problem with them. A lot of them say that they're fake. A lot of them are against that. Well, actually, the fact of the matter is, history does favor them, and genetics do favor them. So we're going to learn about their history. We're going to learn about their genetics. We're going to learn about their language. When does Yiddish come about? I think that's a very pertinent topic. So brothers and sisters can stop talking about the Ashkenazis without knowing about the Ashkenazis. You understand? And like we say here at the source, man, you got to bring forth evidence and then make your claim from the evidence. Don't do it the other way around. Zion Warring, exactly. They have the genetics. They have the genetics. So anybody claiming that they don't, you're being fallacious. So today, that's what we're going to get into, man. Y'all know how we rock it, man. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. You guys have been a great support. I appreciate every one of you guys. We've been having 50, 60 people watching us, and we appreciate all of the eyeballs and all of the attention that the channel has been getting to help this channel grow. And we're going to continue to feed you with content. You understand? Feed you with scientific data, theories, hypothesis, and give you guys our worldview and how we view things here at the source. So today we're going to deal with the Ashkenazis. Who are the Ashkenazis? When did they start? Where did they originate? What part of the world did they start? When did they begin their trek? Where did they migrate to? So we're going to deal with these things because a lot of Black Hebrew Israelites are ignorant. They're ignorant when it comes to Ashkenazis. They just say, oh, they're a bunch of devils. They're this, that, they're this, and that, and the third, and then wonder why your page gets shut down by the ADL, or wonder why you get all this flack on social media. Maybe you need to educate yourself about these people before you speak about them. Also, white people the same way. They don't even know about the Ashkenazi Jews. They just know of them, and you could tell they haven't, they haven't took the time out to actually study and figure out who these people are, where they come from, what is their language, what is their backstory, and that's what we're here to do today. So, with no further ado, we're gonna get straight to the meat and potatoes of this. This is going to be a multi-part series because I'm actually going to be reading a book to you guys. Before I get into this book, I am well covered under the Fair Use Act. Section 107 of the Copyright Act provides the statutory framework for determining whether something is a fair use and identifies certain types of uses such as criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. So we are covered under Section 107. So we're doing this thing to give our critiques, to give commentary, to teach people. Hopefully, people learn from today's lesson, and for research and scholarship purposes. So we can learn about the Ashkenazi. All right, from there, let's open up the book and let's get started. Oh, before we get into this, I have one request of the audience. I have just one request for you guys. One request. I don't need your money. I don't need anything else. I don't need you to join a congregation. I don't need you to do no donations. I don't need you to join a political party. What I need you to do is just one simple thing before we get started.
Hi, everybody. Time to use your noggin. How do you use your noggin, you say? Well, here's how you use it every day. Use your noggin when you write a letter. Use your noggin when you make it better. Use your noggin when you play guitar. Use your noggin to spot a star. Use your noggin when you make a scene. Use your noggin when you mix up green. Use your noggin to play a game. When you use your noggin, it's never the same. Use your noggin to sing a song. Ask another noggin to sing along. Use your noggin with your computer. Hey, that's Z. What could be cuter? Use your noggin. That's what it's for.
I'm using my noggin.
Are you using yours?
I'm using my noggin. Are you using yours? That's the only thing I ask from you guys. Use your noggin when you're viewing our content. So we're going to go straight to the book and begin to read from today's book. Ashkenazic Jews and Biblical Israelites is the title of this book. And I actually own this book. by this brother here, Jitz von Straten. So I don't know how to speak that language. So this word, bear with me. Didn't mean to butcher this man's name, but this is this is the name of the guy who wrote this book. So Ashkenazic Jews and the Biblical Israelites, the early demographic. Demographic is dealing with the movement of people. Demographic development of East European Ashkenazis. Right? So he doesn't really have a prologue here. He just have acknowledgments, pretty much giving thanks to the people that gave him inspiration or help on writing this book. So let's get straight to it. Introduction. So you guys can learn about the Ashkenazis. Who are the Ashkenazis? So let's figure that out here together. It says the study of the beginnings and origin of specifically East European Ashkenazic Jewry becomes an unrewarding activity when one finds out that nowadays accepted hypotheses about the origin are not tenable and should be revised. So he opens up this book and says a lot of the hypotheses, a lot of the rumors about who the Ashkenazi are, one of them being the Khazarian hypothesis, cannot be backed up. These are not tenable. Tenable means it's pretty much, it's not plausible. You can't really use or prove it, actually. There's no evidence to really prove it, no solid or concrete evidence. So that's why he said this task is unrewarding. There's a lot of hard work and unraveling all of the hypotheses and whatnot. He goes on to say, these hypotheses pertain to, number one, the beginnings of German Jewry during the 9th to 10th century. So you guys have to understand, Ashkenazi Jews are pretty new. They're pretty new. Ashkenazi rights and culture and the people actually formulating this Ashkenazi cluster are actually pretty new. They're 9th, 10th century, 8th, 9th century, somewhere around there is when they formulate and become a distinct cluster and begin to migrate and begin to spread Ashkenazi rights. It reads again, number 2, it says the mass migration from Germany to East Europe during the Middle Ages, and 3, the resulting explosive population increases of East European Jewry between 1500 and 1800. Explosive according to Europe and criteria for that period. With regard to the beginnings of Ashkenazic Jewry, the decree by Emperor Constantine in 321 that the Jews also had to be represented in the city council appears to be generally accepted by Jewish and non-Jewish history scholars. For example, there is not a shred of doubt that at the beginning of the 4th century, the city of Cologne had a Jewish community. Not only that, this community must have been important. Following a negative remark about an early Jewish presence in Brittany, Toch writes, likewise, the situation is not much better in the Germanic provinces at the beginning of the 4th century. As emphasized by a written source, there was an organized and mighty Jewish community in Cologne. A second general law by Emperor Constantine in 330 certainly cannot have anything to do with Cologne. According to the currently accepted hypothesis, a continuous Jewish presence started during the second half of the 9th century. See, again, we're going to see a theme that's replete. We're going to see time stamps in this book. When do we start seeing these people becoming a distinct cluster and spreading this Ashkenazic traditions and cultic practices? We're going to see that, again, 8th, 9th century, so we're floating around there. So that's when they start. They're not going back to 1st century or before that. They're not even going before the Common Era. They actually are a Common Era cluster. So let that be noted. It said it denies a continuous Jewish presence in Cologne between 321 and 330 in the 9th century. What are the arguments? There is no information about a Jewish presence between 321 and the 9th century. I want to emphasize that Jewish history scholars appear to agree on the presence of a well-developed Jewish community in 321, despite the fact there is no information about this community available from the period before 321. Now, I also want to make a note about this right here. Scholars agree that Jews were in Cologne, right, which I believe is in like Germany. They believe that Jews were actually settled in Cologne, even though there's no information on it. So we don't have really much written information before that. We just know Jews were there. Why do I find this interesting and eye-opening is because we have a lot of African Jewry that we hear people write about in Arabic sources, we hear people refer to in Arabic sources and other sources that say, hey, Jews are here, but we really don't have anything else written about them. Case in point, the Jews of Lamlam, or the Jews of Quamnuria in West Africa, right? Or the Maghrib, right? We hear about people in passing, writing it down about, hey, there's Jewish people here, there's Jewish migrants here, there's Jewish traders here. They live in West Africa, they live in Algiers, Algeria, they live here, they trade here, they have they are Karaites. You have Karaites in West Africa. The Jews of Wagala, the dark Jews of Wagala, the black Jews of Wagala are actually Karaite Jews, which is very interesting because Karaite Jews come from Iraq and Persia. So how did that translate all the way to West Africa? It means people migrated, endemic diffusion. But just like the Jews in Cologne, we have a written documentation noting that there's a Jewish community in Cologne, Germany, 321. Nothing else written about it. That doesn't negate that they actually were there. That's the point I'm trying to bring out here from this book. So just like we see the Jewish communities in Africa, we have the historical attestation of them. We don't have a lot of writing detailing about them, right? Just like the Jews in Cologne, and I don't see anybody harassing people on the internet about, oh, well, you don't have anything written about them, or, oh, well, how do we trust it? You don't hear that about this group. It's just accepted. And we know exactly why, because skin color. We know exactly why. A lot of people are influenced by racism. But that's for another story. Let's get back into this. So continuing reading, it says, was the Jewish community flown in maybe by Alitalia on the day of the decree? According to Weinreich, the reason for the lack of information between 330 and 9th century is the violent arrival of the Franks, Germanic tribes, who caused the Jews to flee to Gaul. And Gaul is, of course, France, right? Before France was called France, it was Gaul. It says, however, Weinreich's view is subject to scrutiny. First of all, the takeover was not that violent, as can be seen by the lack of burned material in the old city wall. Second, Cologne had a mixed Roman-Germanic population long before the 4th century. Third, why would the Franks, who were not yet Christians, have more problems with the Jews than with the rest of the population? Fourth, nothing is known about the groups who left, so why all of a sudden the Jews? All this makes is very unlikely that an important Jewish community disappeared just like that without a clear-cut reason. Not every historian is convinced of the currently accepted hypothesis. And this hypothesis goes along with the Rhine. They'll say, oh, we started in the Rhine because of the Jewish community in Cologne. So they try to say all Ashkenazi Jews come from the Rhine. They come from Cologne, which there's no evidence of that at all. But, there's not that many people questioning this. And in this book, he points out that there's a lack of criticism about this origin. There's a lack of criticism about this hypothesis. There's a lack of criticism about this folktale, this folklore. But the reason why it is a lack of criticism is because, hey, hyphenated whiteness. If you're white, you right. If you're black, you whack. We're just gonna tell how he is. They can make their folklore, have their origin story, say they come from Cologne, little to no evidence connecting them to Cologne, and no one says a word. So I want y'all to, really tap in and hone in on that and see the difference. It says here, not every historian is convinced of the current accepted hypothesis. Caro assumes that Jews may have continued to live in Cologne similarly to the situation in Gaul, but the confirmed history of German Jewry only started in the 10th century. Only in the 10th century. Remember that. Remember these time stamps. 8th, 9th, 10th century. It's fairly new. A similar careful view is expressed by Brewer and Gratz, who are of the opinion that continuity cannot be excluded. A much more logical explanation for the lack of information may well be that in 881, the Vikings invaded Cologne and destroyed the city archives. Modern research has settled the romantic idea of continuous Jewish settlement from the classical antiquity unto the Middle Ages. The regularly advanced presence of Jews in the late Roman Cologne and perhaps also in other places is irrelevant for the further development. However, German Jewry started much earlier, or put differently, it continued as was shown by the oldest archaeological information about Cologne reported by Krauss in published by Kober in 1945 in the Proceedings of the American Academy for Jewish Research, in which he discussed the archaeological work by Otto Kross in 1922. According to Kober, Kross was well acquainted with the field of Roman antiquities. The work was in the form of a manuscript and had not been published. I follow Kober's discussion of the article rather extensively, as it is relevant for the discussion of an early Jewish presence in Cologne. The site of excavation was Judenbuchel. The height of the Jews in Cologne consisted of an elevation rising a few feet above the land surrounding it. It is identical with the old Jewish cemetery. In 1922, the mount was used to enlarge the freight yard at the Bone Gate. During the necessary groundwork, human bones in Roman graves and old stone walls were found. The Jewish community requested to have the bones removed. According to Kross, the oldest Jewish cemetery in Cologne had been uncovered. The cemetery tract apparently embraced 29,200 square meters. 6,800 were dug up by the contractors of the railroad. 11,400 were uncovered by the archaeological excavations. The cemetery had been in use since Roman times. Thus, Kross did not, well, I don't know why I don't have this highlighted. That's good stuff. So thus, Kross did not excavate the whole area. This is noteworthy, as we'll see further on. This ancient Jewish cemetery is identical with the medieval Jewish cemetery as far as the location is concerned. It was not a pagan cemetery, nor a Roman Christian cemetery, and also not medieval Christian graveyard. The orientation of the skeletons in the east-west direction, the position of the hands at the sides, and occurrence of Hebrew tombstones when considered in connection with the documentary evidence from the 12th century left no doubt this was actually the most ancient Jewish cemetery in Cologne. Again, Cologne is in Germany. It says Kross concluded that the graves are from the 270 CE. However, not everybody agreed with Kross' conclusions, such as Fremensdorf, who became a director of the Roman and Germanic division of the Wallraf-Richartz Museum in 1923. Further on, I will refer to Fremensdorf again with regard to the dating of body graves excavated in 1937. However, the Kross had checked in his material once more. He stuck to his conclusion that the graves belonged to the Roman and subsequent periods up to and including Middle Ages. When viewed critically, there is no conclusive reason for rejecting Kross' interpretation without going into the whole discussion. Kober concludes that it is possible to assume that the vaulted and stone-covered graves come from the late Roman period, or in the view of the fact that the Roman occupation ended about 400, from the 5th to 6th centuries at the latest. Although we cannot determine the exact period from which the stone-covered graves of the Jewish cemetery come, we may at least assume with Otto Kross that in general the Jewish cemetery outside the Bone Gate dates back to the late Roman times. So again, what is the purpose of all this? They're trying to figure out were there continuity in Cologne from 200 CE to the Middle Ages. Reading on, it says discovery of Kross is also mentioned by Schuyler and Hart. There is more information about the early presence of Jews in Cologne that, to the best of my knowledge, has not been referred to earlier in connection with our subject. Fremensdorf reported the excavation of 2 body graves from the 1st and 3rd century at the corner of the Bonner and Raderberger Strasse in Cologne. The location is part of the Roman graveyard adjacent to the late antique Jewish cemetery. His assertion agrees with his conclusions about the 1922 excavation mentioned above. The question is, how reliable is this conclusion? In the State Archive file BAR, it states here, let me go down. It gives you the website. It is an evaluation of Fremensdorf by the SD in 1937. The SD was an intelligence agency of the SS in the Nazi Party. The evaluation says, translated from German, Fremensdorf, although he is an archaeologist, he is very concerned about emphasizing the German elements in the Roman culture in the Rhineland. However, he is ambitious. In view of his positive evaluation of the SD, it becomes questionable how reliable Fremensdorf is when it comes to describing Jewish graves in Cologne. Interestingly, the Fumboker documentary file sorted according to the year of the excavation, in which the precise data of the excavation are described, present in Roman's German Museum in Cologne, are difficult to be consulted. Scoop's personal communication writes, The archaeologists who were carrying out the work were unaware of the border between the two cemeteries because they had not carried out topographical research beforehand, and the border was not marked. At one point, they dug up 2 body graves unknowingly. They had already entered the old Jewish cemetery. They were graves of persons who had not been cremated and whose graves had a tent-like tile roof, which is typical for graves of the 4th century, late antique, and especially the Jewish graves excavated by Cross in direct vicinity. So they neutrally described the graves as body graves of the 4th century. In the non-Jewish cemetery, the majority of the graves were cremations or had a different grave architecture. It is therefore most likely that they had found Jewish graves. These graves still had bones because cross excavation did not cover this part of the Judenbuchel Buchel cemetery. We are lucky that the archaeologists did not know that they were Jewish graves because it is inconceivable that they would have reported about Jewish graves during the Nazi period. So here we have a clearly documented find of late antique Jewish graves in Cologne, describing in a neutral way. The consequence is that if a Jewish cemetery existed in late antiquity, what Otto Cross and Kober already suggested as early as 1922, then the presence of a larger community is obvious. If there would have been a discontinuity in Cologne, the medieval and post-medieval Jewish cemetery could likely not have been in the identical place of the Roman Jewish burial place. Even more important, a continuity until the late Middle Ages must then be mandatory, in addition to evidence resulting from the Carolinian synagogue, as we will see further on. However, modern research presents a contradictory image, namely of discontinuous development. The late Roman period did not conclude with the end of the occupation of 400. It is known that Roman customs were cherished for a long time after 400. The information by Cross via Kober means that a continuous Jewish presence in Cologne is a serious possibility. As mentioned before, a lack of information about Jewish presence after 330 does not prove anything, especially when the city archives were destroyed. The finding of the Jewish graves and lack of good reason for departure of only Jews from Cologne make Toch's denial of continuous Jewish presence questionable. And you know what's crazy about this? And I'm going to continue reading this. But you know what's crazy about this? They're using circumstantial evidence to prove that there's a Jewish continuity in Cologne, Germany. They're using cemetery, they're using graves, they're using the fact that it was mentioned. Well, they had documentary evidence, or it's mentioned by ancient men during that time, which makes it a primary, right? That's what a primary source is. It's a writing, a recording of a person that actually witnessed it, that are contemporary with those people's or event that's being recorded, right? So when we look at this information, positing a continuity from Cologne all the way to medieval times. And you're going to see why he's arguing in this later on in the book, because he's going to show you that Ashkenazis really don't come from this group that's here because there is a continuity. But we're going to get there when we get there. But it shows the biasness, because we see that this can be accepted in scholarship. But when we bring up, hey, you have a Jewish group that's in West Africa. You have the Jews of Waragala, for instance. We have the Luango Jews. Oh, well, we only mention them. We only see them mentioned in history. We know nothing else about them. But it's the same thing with the Jews of Cologne. It's the same exact deal with the Jews of Cologne. Right here, we just read it. It says, as mentioned before, the lack of information about a Jewish presence after 330 does not prove anything, especially when the city archives were destroyed. So it's like, just because we don't see anything else written about these people, or we have a paucity, as we say in academia, paucity, a lack of or a scarce amount of records recording these people, does not mean they don't exist, or if it's made up or it's a farce. You understand? It's like when we're dealing with Africa, you play by different rules. When we deal with Europe, everything's allowed. It's just crazy. And a lot of African Americans, like your Sonnetters, your Garfields, and the people that follow that camp, they think like that. Well, if it's African, then we're not going to allow that. But you can clearly see that the bias and racism is pretty much obvious. It's blatant. But let's get back to the reading. It states, it also puts Toch's negative remarks about the Constantine decree of 330 in another light, because if it was a general decree, it may have applied to Cologne as well. After all, there's no reason to assume that the Jewish community all of a sudden had disappeared in 330. Until the end of the 90s of the last century, the oldest synagogue of Cologne was thought to have been built at the beginning of the 11th century. Kober writes, translated from German, according to a late tradition, which had little value, the synagogue was built in 1012 or 1040. Kober made a good assessment of the tradition. At the end of the 90s, published a sensational archaeological discovery. The synagogue was actually a Carolingian synagogue built on top of an older building, possibly an antique synagogue. The construction of the synagogue was started close to the end of the 8th century and ended around 881. The city of Cologne must have had a reasonably developed Jewish community at the beginning of the 9th century. Otherwise, it could not have started to build a synagogue. And what else does this always prove? I want my brothers that are labeled Black Hebrew Israelite to understand that you did have Jews in Europe. You had Jews in Germany. You had Jews in East Europe. You had, even Josephus tells you that Jews went to Europe. Even Paul tells you there are Jews in Europe. Hello? Paul was born where? In Rome. Tarsus, right? I believe Tarsus. That's Italy. That's Europe. Come on, use your noggin. There were Jews in Europe. That's just a fact. That's empirical. That can be observed. We have documentary evidence of this. Let me keep reading. It said, at a Congress in Frankfurt, A/M in 2003, Toch attacked Schutz's archaeological find of a Carolingian synagogue with political arguments. He was obviously unable to refute Schutz's conclusion with archaeological arguments. In addition to the lack of a solid reason for the supposed disappearance of the Jewish community of Cologne during the late Roman period and discovery of the late Roman graves by cross, the finding of a Carolingian synagogue is another indication of a continuous Jewish presence up to the Carolingian period. It is not clear why Toch so vehemently against a continuous Jewish presence between the 4th and 9th century. With regard to the second hypothesis, East European Ashkenazis originated in Germany. This is the second hypothesis here. Watch this. I propose an eternal origin via Ukraine, as it is called today. So the author of this book is going to be making arguments saying, hey, the East European Ashkenazis actually come from Ukraine, not Germany. This is why he's walking you through the people of Cologne and the Rhine, because a lot of Ashkenazis to this day will tell you that they get their start, their inception, their genesis in the Rhine, but there's evidence that oppose that. And he's going to get into it here, right? It says, with regard to the second hypothesis, East European Ashkenazis originated in Germany, I propose an alternative origin via southern Ukraine, as it is called today. What made me reject the hypothesis that East European Jewry originated in Germany? Briefly, the accepted hypothesis states that during the pogroms of the Middle Ages between 1096 and roughly 1500, German Jewry migrated to Eastern Europe, Poland, and Lithuania. This view is based specifically on publications by two East European Jewish history scholars, Baron, 1957 and 1976, and Wein, 1972 to 1973. I would therefore call it the Baron-Wein hypothesis. It is based on assumptions about mass migrations culminating in remark by Enquiry that at the end of the Middle Ages, Western Europe was cleared of Jews. In order to show how unrealistic Enquiry's statement is, I would like to refer to the Stambach der Frankfurter shooting by Detz, 1907, who studied the age of the Jewish and non-Jewish families in Frankfurt and refers to the situation at this time. This is translated from German. I'm going to read it. It says, back to the time of Luther, only about 20 Christian families could be traced back. Against this finding, the age of the Jewish community here that I now demonstrated should be designated as a very surprising. The following chronological order of Jewish family names shows the solid evidence that among them, not only relatively, but also absolutely, more old families were present than among the remaining population of our city. He then shows that of the present Jewish families, 33 could trace their roots back to the period between 1316 and 1400, and another 33 to a period between 1400 and 1500. Despite the fact that there is no evidence for the mass migrations, the Baron-Wein hypothesis arrives at the conclusion that East European Jewry originates from Germany. On the other hand, German Jewish history scholars, specifically the authors of the reference works Germania Judica, came to different conclusions about this period. The later produced a typical German piece of work in the sense that it is thorough. The number of references to archival sources to back up the content is impressive. However, the work shows no substantial migration of Jews from Germany or Bohemia to Eastern Europe. The conclusion can therefore only be that German Ashkenazis and East European Ashkenazis have a different origin and thus should not be considered as one population. So he's just going off of the evidence. The evidence is a lot of these East Europeans are not from Germany, they're not from the Rhine, but actually they would be from areas likened to Ukraine. That's his argument. All right, so let's get back into the book. It says here, despite the lack of evidence for the mass migrations, the bar and wine hypothesis have become the accepted hypothesis about the origin of East European Ashkenazis. For example, Botticini et al. Do not even mention Germania Judica in their discussion about the origin of East European Ashkenazis. As a consequence, the above-mentioned migrations, the number of Jews in Eastern Europe at the end of the Middle Ages in 1500 was supposedly rather low, because there were not that many Jews in Germany during that period. The archfathers of Jewish population sizes in Eastern Europe in 1500 and 1650 are also Baron and Wine. Between 500 and 1650, the Jewish population increased from 30,000 to 450,000. That is a huge leap within just 150 years. You see that? Reading on, it says, or from 10,000 to 200,000. And 100 sticks to the total of 50,000 Jews in Poland in 1500. It is important to note there is no factual basis for these population sizes. When we realize that in the 1800s there were just over 2 million Jews in Eastern Europe, the Jewish annual growth rate between 1500 and 1800 must have been explosive, more than 1%. Relative recently, it became clear that according to modern demographers, such population increases were not possible in Europe during that period, which put an end to the third hypothesis as well. A more recent hypothesis states that East European Jewry originated mostly in the Czech lands, Silesia, and former Eastern German provinces. I will come back to this hypothesis in Chapter 2. The origin of Yiddish language is also controversial. The three major hypotheses concerning the origin of Yiddish are the Rhineland hypothesis, the Danube hypothesis, and the Sorbs hypothesis. I suggested a fourth hypothesis, the Bavarian Czech hypothesis, is more appropriate to explain the origin of Yiddish in Eastern Europe. And we're going to have fun when we get to the Yiddish part because that's pretty much the adopted language of the Ashkenazi. And I also want you guys to know that Yiddish is an amalgam, just like the cultures and Ashkenazi cults, cultic rites. A lot of that stuff is an amalgam of East Europeans. And I want you guys to know that for a reason, because what happens is when we're talking about West African Jewry, they say, well, these people, the Wolof people, practice pagan practices. These Africans practice voodoo. They practice bloodletting. They practice scarification. Same thing with these European Jews. They came around other groups. They absorbed cultures. They created new cultures. They start teaching about the golem. Have you read the Kabbalah? Hello. They start teaching about taking spirits and put them in golems. Or they taught about the sword of Moses, where if you want to kill a man, you write his name on a piece of paper, you drop blood in sand, and you do all this stuff to do this cultic practice. So no different than Yiddish. It's an amalgam of what the people they are around or the people they were introduced to, they just mix with their culture. That's what happens when you mix and you amalgamate. And the same thing with Yiddish. It's a language, it's an amalgam, it's a mixture of different elements of different languages. So when we get to that chapter, we're going to break that down. So, reading on, it says the consequence of the opposing conclusion of the two approaches to Ashkenazic history, Baron Wine versus Germania Judica, is that I had to decide which historiography to follow, because the historiography in Germania Judica is superior. It does not include implausible population increases either. I did not have much of a choice. Interestingly, one does not find a thorough discussion in the literature on the differences between the two approaches in historiography. Thus, my rejection of the nowadays accepted Bernstein hypothesis has nothing to do with a new hypothesis. It is only the result of my decision to consider Germanica Judica a more reliable source. So he explains why he has the argument he has, why he's saying that, hey, these East European Ashkenazis actually come from Ukraine and not from the Rhine, not from Cologne. As the Bernstein hypothesis and hypothesis by Stanford about the origin of East European Ashkenazis are still the generally accepted explanations of their origin, most geneticists who study the origin of Ashkenazic Jewry base their research on the above-mentioned historians, and thus do not differentiate between German and East European Ashkenazi. This becomes particularly clear when statistic models are used, including implausible population increases. Therefore, my choice of Germania Judica also has implications for the elevation of genetic research pertaining to the Ashkenazis. Genetic research has to agree now with an origin of the East European Ashkenazi that does not imply Germany as the place of origin. In other words, genetic results become questionable if they are based on the out of Germany hypothesis, with its high population increases. Now, that's funny. You had the out of Africa hypothesis. With the Ashkenazi, you got the out of Germany hypothesis. The evidence is pointing towards somewhere else. All right. Let's continue reading. It says, in the view of the discussion so far, I figure that the study of the origin of Ashkenazic Jewry requires a multidisciplinary approach that includes the fields of history, demography, linguistics, archaeology, and genetics. Investigating the combination of these disciplines is not only necessary because all four have something to do with the origin and spread of Ashkenazic Jewry, but also because, as we saw before, studies of each discipline separately led often to controversial results. I had to try and find another way to explain the origin of East European Ashkenazis. In 2011, I published a partial solution that showed that within Europe, East European Jewry migrated from what we call today roughly the region of southern Ukraine into more northern and western parts of Eastern Europe. So again, his starting point for the Ashkenazi, Eastern European Ashkenazis, is actually in Ukraine and not Germany. A Jewish presence in Eastern Europe around the Black Sea already before the beginning of the Common Era is mentioned in the literature. The possibility that these Jews are part of the ancestors of today's East European Ashkenazis is systematically ignored or even denied by almost all historians who deal with this subject. So I also want to talk about that because a lot of people, a lot of BHIs, a lot of Black Hebrew Israelites, they try to demarcate Ashkenazis, but they have the documentary evidence and they also have the genetics because they do have markers that are Afro-Asiatic that are related to Natufians, EM123, EM34, EM35. You cannot get around that. So be mindful of that. You just got to be objective. Don't be like the other guys. Don't be like the other side that just completely rejects anything that deals with them because you'll become them. You'll become the racist. You'll become the ignorant. And we're trying to illuminate people. We're trying to elucidate ancestries, and we're trying to do education. That's what we promote here. We're pro-literacy and we're pro-education. This is not about skin color. This is not about color bias. This is not about, oh, he's Black, he's white. No, these people are Jews. Let's keep reading. It says here, the next question to be answered were, where did these Jews come from? When did they get there? And could they have been ancestors of today's East European Ashkenazis? I tried to provide an answer in the article entitled The Origin of East European Ashkenazim via a southern route. The main conclusion of the article is that the ancestors of East European Jews first came from Anatolia in Greece, and later on from Italy. However, more questions remain. For example, how do today's Ashkenazis relate to the biblical Israelites genetically? What do the different lineages of today's lay Jews, Jewish priests, and Levites mean? In order to get the answers to these and other questions, I included in this study also archaeological data from the biblical period between about 1200 BC and the beginning of the Common Era. I decided to follow mainly the archaeological work of Israel Finkelstein, an Israeli top archaeologist, because his realistic conclusions made sense to me. The field of genetics will receive extra attention. This book will be based on some extent on the above mentioned article. Which authors do I refer to? I do not pretend to have read every article and every book that relates to the subjects that are discussed. To the best of my knowledge, the most important literature is being referred to. Sadly enough, it's not always immediately clear whether or not the information a historian dishes up is true. Wrong information may be the result of an unfounded idea, a misquote, or falsification. This is especially a problem when the information is taken from earlier works. In such a case, one has to check the earlier source. In addition to having come across the phenomenon doing a peer review, I also encountered such a situation when I wrote this book. It was a very frustrating experience because the information seemed very important. At the end of 2019, I started to read the book YASHAR-YA'OH, the first Ashkenazis, by Asher Frischman. In the introduction, he writes, however, people from the east of all people, especially the heads of the Talmud schools, already define Ashkenaz as Germany. And they mention Ashkenazis as Jews who lived in communities in Western Europe. So far, nothing wrong. But then comes the surprise. The information comes from a source written in the 9th century, the prayer book of YASHAR-YA'OH by Amram ben Sheshna, who died around 875. This is exciting news because it shows that in the 9th century there were Jewish communities in Germany. He speaks of Ashkenazis. It seemed to be too good to be true. I went to the Ras Daliana, the Judica Library of the University of Amsterdam, and read the book. No Ashkenaz, no Germany, and no Ashkenazi. I felt as the saying in German goes. I can't say that German word. I don't know how to say that. So it says these days, this kind of information would be called fake news. The author was unable to tell me why the book was referred to. I only referred to this book as an example of wrong information and would not have bothered otherwise. I tried to discuss authors that are representative of the different opinions on each subject. The number of authors discussed varies with the subject. For example, few authors who still follow the barren wine hypothesis will be referred to because enough has been written about the hypothesis. I will quote authors who do not agree with me and also not with the barren wine hypothesis. In this chapter, in chapter 1, I will use archaeological data to give short historical overview of the ethnic composition in Palestine before the beginning of the Common Era, which is a new necessary topic with respect to the origin of Ashkenazic Jewry. It will be followed by the switch from Judeans or Israelites to Jews and the change in definition of Ashkenazis from Ashkenazis by descent to Ashkenazis by rights, which is important. You have to know that. It says in chapter 2, historical and demographic problems with an origin from Germany, the Czech lands, and Eastern German lands will be discussed. Only the problematic topics of the disciplines that were used earlier will be referred to. As to historiography, the controversial results are mainly related to the interpretation of migrations of Ashkenazic Jewry during the Middle Ages. The discussion of demographic aspects will be limited to the outdated data of East European Jewish population increases. Because the field of genetics has become a particularly important field today, Chapter 3 will be dedicated to the discussion of the genetic results that are linked to the barren wine hypothesis in one way or another. The chapter will show that it is necessary to combine genetics with reliable historiography and demography. Now, I want y'all to say this, I want to toot my own horn, anything, but that's what we do at the source. That's what we do. We combine genetics with historiography and demography. That's what we do here. That's the methodology. We look at genetics. We look at the historiography. We line them up, put them in parallel, see if they line up, and harmonize genetics, demography, and historiography. It's the same thing he does in chapter 3. So when we get there, we will get there, and we're going to have fun with it. It says the importance of German Jewish literature will conclude the chapter. Chapter 4 will deal with the historical and genetic evidence for a Jewish presence around the Black Sea before and after the beginning of the Common Era. The question of why East European Jews speak Yiddish will be answered in Chapter 5. The answer to this question will be narrowed to the phenomenon that a Slavic-speaking Jewish population switched to Yiddish. To show that historical and genetic problems do not occur in Ashkenazis alone, the proposition that Turkish Jews or Sephardic Jews will be discussed in Chapter 6. The chapter will be followed by a general summary of the foregoing chapters. Finally, the epilogue, I will give my personal view on what is happening to the discussion about the origin of Ashkenazic jewelry and related subjects. All right. Y'all want me to clear chapter 1 tonight? You know, I'm a reading warrior. Pro literacy all day, man. Who said black people can't read? Let's knock out chapter 1 tonight. I'm going to finish this whole book live. I want you guys to learn Ashkenazi history. I want black Hebrew Israelites to learn Ashkenazi history so you can stop being ignorant of it. Stop speaking about this topic. Stop talking about Ashkenazi without knowing what the hell you're talking about. What are you referring to? You can't talk about their origin, their language, their customs, and who they are. You have to take out the time to read. I just need y'all to read, man. That's all. Take out some time. We're pro-literacy here. We promote reading. We promote the obtaining of books and learning knowledge.
Butterfly in the sky, I can go twice as high. Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow. I can go anywhere, friends to know and ways to grow, a reading rainbow.
I can go anywhere. Let's get it, man. Reading Rainbow. So, this is chapter 1. Israelites, Judeans, Jews, and Ashkenazis. What information do we have about the history and ethnic composition of the early Israelites, emergent Israel, as Lutcher 2017 calls them? Thanks to extensive archaeological research, reliable information about the inhabitants of what was called Canaan has become available. Information about this period is necessary in order to understand the genetic relationship between Ashkenazis and these inhabitants, their supposed ancestors. First time the name Israel appears in an extra biblical source, it's on the Merneptah stele from 1207 BC. All you guys should be familiar with that. It says it continues to say the stele commemorates the victory of Pharaoh Merneptah over 3 cities in Canaan, Ashkelon, Gezer, YASHAR-YA'OH, and Israel. The first 2 are in the coastal region. According to Nahum, YASHAR-YA'OH was most likely in the Transjordan. He provides three data to make his point plausible. One of them is the Armana letter. In this letter, YASHAR-YA'OH is located in Bashan region, which is in the Transjordan. The name Israel does not appear as the name of a town or a region. On the stele, it says Israel's laid waste, his seed is not. Lutcher concludes from the wording that it is Israel's seed families that has been annihilated. The oldest source does not give any information about the ethnic composition of Israel. Furthermore, it's also not clear what the geographic connection is between Israel and the region of Israelite monarchy that came about at the end of the 11th century BCE. Finkelstein and Silberman showed that the early Israelites started out as nomads, appeared around 1200 BC as herders in the hills of the Canaan, and with time became farmers. Their culture was a simple one of subsistence and was clearly different from that of the lowland Canaanites. Their villages were not fortified, which shows that they had friendly relations with their non-Israelite neighbors. The initial population must have consisted of some 45,000 people divided over 250 villages, the author concludes. The emergence of early Israel was an outcome of collapse of the Canaanite culture, not its cause. And most of the Israelites did not come from outside Canaan. They emerged from within it. There was no mass exodus from Egypt. There was no violent conquest of Canaan. Most of the people who formed early Israel were local people, the same people whom we see in the highlands throughout the Bronze and Iron Age. The early Israelites were ironies themselves, originally Canaanites. So, of course, that's Finkelstein. If y'all don't understand Finkelstein's early work, that's pretty much his argument. A peasant revolt model where he says the Israelites are actually Canaanites that revolted or peacefully emerged in the Canaanite society, right? That's his theory. Read on. But highland Canaanites also have to originate from somewhere, and probably from somewhere different to the lowland Canaanites, because as he mentioned before, the material culture was different. The origin of the early Israelites is not known. There are no local written sources from that period. There is written information about Canaan in the Amarna letters from the 14th century BCE. In these letters, the diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian and Canaanite authorities, two unruly groups, are mentioned, Shoshu and Aparu. The Shoshu were pastoral nomads whom the Egyptians called plunderers. During the late 14th century BCE, they formed a large portion of the population that lived in the central part of the territory that later would be designated as the Kingdom of Judah, especially in the steppe and the highlands. It's not clear what relationship it is between the Shoshu and the Israelites. In the Egyptian sources, the Aparu are described as a bunch of outlaws or as mercenaries. Therefore, the name does not refer to an ethnic group. They were ones who made most of the problems. Finkelstein and Severin described them as uprooted peasants, herders who sometimes turned bandits, sometimes sold themselves as mercenaries, and were in both cases a disruptive element by either local rulers or the Egyptian administration to maintain the stability of their rule. The authors wonder whether David, before he became king, could be considered an Aparu chieftain with his gang. This idea is based on the fact that the Aparu chieftain had previously become a political leader, and on the resemblance between the biblical stories and the description of the Aparus and the Amarna letters. In their conclusion, they stop short of calling David and his men Aparu. Instead, they write the most plausible historical scenario is that the Aparu-like leader, known as David, emerged as a local strongman at a time of political chaos. It is clear, though, that the early Israelites lived in Canaan for about 200 years before King Saul, around 1025, appeared on the scene. From a historical point, the only information about the origin of the Israelites comes from the Hebrew Bible. Israelites are the descendants of the archfather Abraham. Is the archfather theory tenable? As an answer to the question at this point, I would like to quote part of the last paragraph of the chapter on the patriarchs, in which authors refer to Jerusalem version of the Torah. The great genius of the 7th century creators of the national epic was the way in which they wove the early stories together without stripping them of their humanity or individual distinctiveness. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob remained at the same time vivid spiritual portraits and the metaphorical ancestors of the people of Israel, and the 12 sons of Jacob were brought into the tradition as junior members of a more complete genealogy. So what he's bringing out is the secular view of the Israelites. I know a lot of y'all religious Jews, y'all can't stomach that. No, they secular. They don't believe that they're actually real people. Grow up. You're going to have people that don't agree with you. They're going to have secular views. That's the view of Finkelstein in the early 2000s, that these people were figurative or metaphorical. So let me keep reading. It says, thus the archfather idea is not right. The author doesn't even agree with the archfather idea, right? It says, but what is the status of the 12 tribes? Are they a metaphor for an ethnic heterogeneity of different tribes? If the latter is the case, it may show up in genetic research, that's what he's going to argue later, that, 12 tribes just mean multi-ethnic group, right? It says, we will jump almost 100 years to an important point in Israelite history, the splitting of the King Solomon kingdom in the year 931 BCE. Jeroboam, the first son of Nebat, became king of the northern part of the country, while Rehoboam followed up his father as king of Judah. During this period, the religious practices in the kingdom of Judah were similar to those in northern kingdom in Judah. Religious ideas were diverse and dispersed. There was the royal cult in the Jerusalem temple. There was the countless fertility and ancestor cults in the countryside. And there was widespread mixing of the worship of Yahweh with that of other gods. Due to all kinds of environmental and economic factors, the northern state became more powerful and numerous than the southern state. Between 884 and 842 BCE, the kingdom of northern Israel was ruled by kings of the Omride dynasty, Omri, Ahab, Ahaziah, and Joram. Their territory consisted of Samaria, the mountainous Galilee, Hazor, in the upper Jordan Valley, large parts of Transjordan between Arnon and Yarmouk rivers, and the coastal plain of Sharon. The highlands of Samaria, the core territory of the state and the seat of the capital, were inhabited by village communities that would have identified themselves culturally and religiously as Israelites. In the northern lowlands, the Jezreel and Jordan valleys, the rural population was comprised mainly of settled peasant villages that had been for centuries closely linked to the Canaanite city-states. Farther north were villages more closely aligned to the Aramean culture of Syria, to the Phoenicians of the coast. Among the middle of the 9th century BCE, King Hazael of Aram, Damascus occupied part of the northern kingdom that the king claimed were originally Aramean. The authors add that the population in the parts of the Israelite kingdoms were partly, if not mostly, Aramean. The occupation did not last much longer than a few decennia, a few decades. It says, after that, Hazael was attacked by the Assyrian king Adad Nirari, who became king in 811 BC. As a result, Hazael had to give up the occupation of the northern kingdom, which became a vassal state of Assyria. Though the kingdom became prosperous around 800 BCE during the reign of King Jeroboam II. The size of the total population of the kingdom was about 350,000, while the size of the population of Judah was hardly bigger than 100,000. In 745, Tiglath-Pileser III became king of Assyria. He began to annex the countries between Assyria and the Mediterranean Sea, including the northern kingdom. Because King Pekah of the northern kingdom had ended his vassaldom to Assyria, the Assyrian king decided to occupy the northern kingdom as well. Tiglath-Pileser III deported part of the population to Assyria and replaced them with new population from Assyria. The systematic resettling of the new populations in recently conquered territory was intended to expand the overall agricultural output of empire. And if you actually read the, is it the obelisk, the black obelisk, or the Kirk inscription? It's one of those two. It tells you that they don't deport everybody. They deport, I think it says 21,000 Israelites were deported during this time. So it's good to have your archaeology game on point when you're reading about this stuff. It says here, according to the King Annals, 13,500 inhabitants of the northern kingdom were deported to Assyria. Oh, well, it says it here, 13,000. There you go. In the Annals of King Sargon II of Assyria about the deportees from Samaria, it says the following. I counted as spoiled. Oh, here we go. 27,000. 27,280 people together with their chariots. I formed a unit with 200 of their chariots for my royal force. I settled the rest in the midst of Assyria. I repopulated Samaria more than before. I brought into it people from countries conquered by my hands. And this is why, when I started studying, thank you, Brother Garfield. When I started studying about this history, I was like, oh, there's historical credence to the biblical narrative because we see stuff like this in the Assyrian inscriptions, right? Let's continue reading. So it says here, the authors suggest from historical and archaeological data, the new settlers from rebellious areas in southern Mesopotamia were settled not only in Samaria, but also in particularly strategic area around Bethel, on the northern border of the still independent kingdom of Judah. In addition, a few 7th century cuneiform texts bearing Babylonian names that have been found in Gezer provide tangible evidence of the presence of these deportees in southwestern territory of the vanquished Israel. It says, in the northern part of the kingdom, the Assyrians left the royal population intact so that they could continue to produce olive oil. The royal population consisted mainly of Canaanites, Phoenicians, and Arameans. But Israelites kept on living in the region of Samaria and Bethel as well. Despite the fact that the royal population was left intact, the deportation is often said to have taken place of the whole population, leading to the 10 tribes, the 10 lost tribes. And that's what y'all got to understand. All Israelites were not deported from the northern kingdom. That is not true. That is not archaeologically tenable, right? As we can see, the documentary evidence is showing you that there were still northern king Israelites remaining in Samaria. Okay. We continue reading. It says, in the 8th century BCE, the population of the northern kingdom living west of the Jordan can be estimated about 225,000. Even if we were to take Sargon's figure of 27,290 Israelite exiles at face value and add to it the 13,500 Israelites claimed by Tiglath-Pileser III to have been deported from the Galilee, the overwhelming majority of the rural Israelite population was not deported. So that's what you guys have to understand. From a historical standpoint, all the Israelites were not deported from Northern Kingdom. The story of the 10 lost tribes is thus strongly exaggerated. As a result of the fall of the Northern Kingdom in 720 BC, large groups of inhabitants fled to the kingdom of Judah and its population, at least doubled, if not tripled. It is not possible to know who these refugees were The kingdom of Israel encompassed vast territories, the regions inhabited divergent groups. Israelites were therefore only one component of the inhabitants living in the kingdom of Israel. Probably also prophets and priests from the north took refuge in the kingdom of Judah. Different deities were not only worshipped in the northern kingdom. In Judah, high places were used to worship various gods, which if you read the biblical narrative, you already know that this is true because it talks about a king rising up and breaking all the idols down and destroying the gods and all of that. So if you read Chronicles and Kings and Samuels, you see that being a theme that's replete during that time. It says here, priests in countryside also regularly burn incense on the high places to the sun, the moon, and the stars. The condemnation of various Judite prophets make it abundantly clear that Yahweh was worshipped in Jerusalem together with other deities, such as Baal, Asherah, and hosts of heaven, and even the national deities of neighboring lands. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of Judah, King Hezekiah decided to do away with all the idolatry in the high places and make the worship of Yahweh the only legitimate form and only in the temple of Jerusalem. After the death of the king, the religious situation in the countryside returned to the way it was before Hezekiah's reforms. And also there, Baal, Asherah, and the host of the heaven could be worshipped again. In addition to the non-Israelite people and refugees from the northern kingdom mentioned above, the demographic situation in Judah became more complex when during the reign of King Josiah, the Assyrians resettled non-Israelite peoples from towns along the Euphrates in the area of Bethel. One of the problems the king faced was that of intermarriage with foreign women, which must have been a common practice among Israelites who survived in the territories of the northern kingdom among the Assyrians that had settled foreign deportees. Intermarriage with non-Israelite women had been a problem all along. In Deuteronomy 7:1 and 4, 7 tribes are mentioned with whom Israelites are not allowed to marry: Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. Most of these tribes probably lived in the area of the once two kingdoms as well. In Joshua 23 and 13, the Israelites are warned against marrying the foreign tribes among whom they are living. The warning is repeated in Judges 2 and 3. The real reason for the warnings may become clear in 1 Kings 11 and 1 and 4, where King Solomon is reported to have all kinds of foreign women, mostly from autochthonous tribes, and to have started to worship other gods because of these women. A similar combination of foreign women in idolatry is found in Malachi, the 2nd chapter, 10 through 12. I would not be surprised if Lorraine provides the actual reason the priests and prophets forbade marrying women of autochthonous tribes. While aware of the dominant influence of mothers and upbringing of children, the priests feared that the spread of mixed marriages would inevitably compromise the stability of Yahwistic faith and cult. And this is what you see again in the ancient world. You're migrating, you're mixing with these women of the autochthonous lands and surrounding areas. What's going to happen? The women are going to be the first teachers of the children. The women are going to teach the children their language. The women are going to teach the children their culture. The women are going to do that. This is why you see what we're going to talk about later on in the book, Ashkenazis are picking up Eastern European traits, Eastern European rights. Because why? This is usually a sex-biased gene flow. It's mostly Ashkenazi men going into Eastern Europe as the author states coming from Europe, coming from Ukraine, and then going into Europe, going into places like France, Gaul, and stuff of that nature, right? And they're starting to marry the local women because it's a sex-biased gene flow. It's mostly men traveling. So when they get to their location, when they get to these different areas of Europe, various localities, they're picking up the autochthonous women there. And guess what? The women, once they're impregnated, they have their children, they're raising their children. Those children are going to adopt that culture. Their children are going to adopt that language of their mother, right? It's just empirical fact at this point that that's what was going on in the ancient world or in times past, right? It says a somewhat related event. Reading on, it says a somewhat related event as far as intermarriage is concerned, although much later, is the forced conversion of Edomites by Johanan the Maccabean in 125 BCE. The extent of the force used is disputed. In 587 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, which marked the end of the kingdom of Judah. Finkelstein and Silberman estimate that between 5 and 20% of the population was exiled to Babylon, mainly the aristocracy. Again, the rural population was left intact during the reign of Cyrus II. The Babylonians were replaced by the Persians, and what was left of the kingdom of Judah became the Persian province of Yehud. The king permitted the exile from the Babylonian period to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. This information is based on 2 edicts. In Ezra the first, chapter 2, verse 2 to 4 and 6, and in chapter 3 through 5. It says, according to Livrani, this information is fake. These edicts were written and used in much later times in order to give prestige and imperial privileges to the temple already built in Jerusalem, and as an answer to the claims of the rival temple in Samaria. The return, in fact, did not take place at the time of Cyrus. By 520, an important return took place under the leadership of Zerubbabel. It's not clear how many returned. An interesting number mentioned in the book of Ezra around the 5th century BC is more than 100 foreign wives and their children who came along with their returning husbands. They had to be sent back to their own country. I wonder if this inhuman decree by the prophet was really carried out. The region north of YASHAR became the province of Samaria. Its mixed population of former Israelites who did not go into exile and of foreign groups resettled in the area by the Assyrians were now known as Samaritans. The inhabitants of Yehud are called Yehudim in Hebrew, which in English is Jews. However, I will not call the inhabitants Jews because, as we will see further on, they are defined differently from the people we call Jews today. The short historical review above shows that the area of both kingdoms was inhabited by a heterogeneous population. Furthermore, the worship of various gods, also by Israelites, should have made intermarriages with the local non-Israelite quite easily. A number of these cases pertaining to non-Israelite women appear in the Hebrew Bible, but they normally refer to women of known male personalities. For example, Zipporah, wife of Moses, daughter of the Midianite priest Jethro, Ruth, the Moabite woman who was the grandmother to King David, and King Ahab of the northern kingdom, who married a Phoenician princess. With the presence of different non-Israelite tribes in the country, intermarriage with common people must have occurred as well, but that information is lost. It's also not clear if there was such information at all because marriage was a private matter. This means that there was not a situation like today where one has to go to an official institution like a rabbi in order to get married. Neither was there a marriage certificate as we know it, in the sense the rabbis instituted such a document. I disagree with him because Near Easterners practice marriage documents. I actually have the ANET, Ancient Near Eastern text, to show you that it's replete. The Near Eastern culture did believe in marriage documents. It says here, the man paid some form of wealth to the family of the bride, and that was it. Whether or not the prophet liked the choice of the woman was not relevant. The prophet wouldn't know about the marriage at all. The repeated warnings in the Hebrew Bible against intermarriage indicate that this was not something out of the ordinary. It should be clear that it's very difficult to find the predecessors of the Judeans who lived around the beginning of the Common Era. If they were themselves Canaanites, as Finkelstein and Silberman called them, we should make a distinction between them, hill Canaanites and lowland Canaanites, who were different culturally. First of all, the hill Canaanites may be descendants of the Aparu or the Shashu, who are not ethnic entities themselves. Then we have the different non-Israelite tribes that may have added to the composition of the Israelites. Judean populations via intermarriage, such as the above-mentioned Midianites and Moabites, or the 7 tribes the Hebrew Bible mentions, with whom Israelites were not allowed to marry, but obviously did. So again, this is evident. The Bible even testifies to this, that the Israelite culture and people absorbed other autochthonous people, foreign people into the mix. Even in the book of Chronicles, we covered before, 1 Chronicles 2, it talks about the tribe of Judah absorbing an Egyptian servant. A man didn't have any sons. He gave his daughter to his Egyptian servant. The Egyptian servant had children, and they even counted his children within the count in the book of Chronicles. So just like the Bible says, a mixed multitude, these people would have been a hodgepodge when we count all of the additional foreign and autochthonous people that were absorbed into the group. It says here, where did we leave off? I think we left off here. It says, furthermore, 2 Assyrian kings resettled people from Assyria in the area of the northern kingdom and the kingdom of Judah, 8th and 7th centuries BCE. These settlers and Edomites should also be added to the list of possible marriage partners. The only conclusion that can be drawn with certainty is that the inhabitants of the 2 kingdoms with the Jewish religion were not descendants of the archfather Abraham or any archfather during the last 3,000 years. Any other conclusion is a question of crystal gazing. Why does it say question of crystal gazing? Because we don't have time machines. There's no way we can go back to that time period. We all wish we could, right? We all wish we could. Hey, shout out Outside the Cube. He said, y'all ain't Jews. Y'all ain't Jews. Well, this video is about Ashkenazic Jews, and I believe the Ashkenazic Jews have an element that are actual real Jews. And that's what I'm getting at, right? You're also worried about discrediting black people as Jews. You come on here a video that's not even talking about that. What's going on, man? Use your noggin. Let me hit Outside the Cube or something, man. I got a request from my brother Outside the Cube. Please use your noggin when you're watching my video.
Hi, everybody. Time to use your noggin. How do you use your noggin, you say? Well, here's how you use it every day. Use your noggin when you write a letter. Use your noggin when you make it better. Use your noggin when you play guitar. Use your noggin to spot a star. Use your noggin when you make a scene. Use your noggin when you mix up green. Use your noggin to play a game. When you use your noggin, it's never the same. Use your noggin to sing a song. Ask another noggin to sing along. Use your noggin with your computer. Hey, that's Z. What could be cuter? Use your noggin. That's what it's for.
I'm using my noggin.
Are you using yours?
Hey, Outside the Cube, I'm using my noggin. Are you using yours? All right, let's continue to read this. This book, again, the title of the video is Ashkenazic Jews and the Biblical Israelites. So that's the topic of today's video, or tonight's rather. All right, so we're moving on from this. Last off said he's crystal gazing. He also mentioned that it's hard to tell if these people are the descendants of the original Jews because of a lot of the admixture and intermixing that was going on during this period that we just laid out. And he gave it from a secular point of view. A lot of you guys that are religious, that are Bible believers, you're probably offended at some of the language and phraseology that he used. You're just going to get over that. Everything you read, everything you watch is not going to agree with your biblical perspective. Everybody doesn't think the Bible's real. Everybody doesn't think that Abraham exists. You just have to accept that. That's the world we live in. We have differing opinions. It's okay. Diversity is okay. We don't live in a fascist country. Everybody's not forced to think this the same way. That's actually pretty good, right? So let me continue to read. Judeans and the Jews. It says, it is a common practice to use the word Jew for today's Jews and also for those who lived in the area of both kingdoms before the beginning of the Common Era. When referring to the inhabitants of both kingdoms before 587 BCE, I will use the term Israelites. Between 587 and the beginning of the Common Era, I will use the term Judeans, supposedly the ancestors of today's Jews. However, the word Judean should not be interpreted as an inhabitant of the territory of the kingdom of Judah only, but also for an inhabitant of the territory of the northern kingdom before and after its destruction in 720 BC. The difference between Judeans and Jews is not well discussed in articles in most books dealing with Jewish history or Jewish genetics. I will therefore first discuss what the term Judeans and Jews imply because of their social and genetic implications. Judeans formed a patrilineal society, and someone with a Judean father was a Judean. The ethnic background of the woman was not important. She became a member of the man's clan. And a lot of people, when I bring this up in argumentum, a lot of people get upset behind this, right? A lot of people get mad, like, oh, why y'all going off the paternal side? I mean, that's the tradition. A lot of ancient Near Eastern places would deal in this manner. And the Israelite people, according to tradition, would count descent patrilineally. That's all. That's how it initially started. And then the Mishnah came along, and then they started to count the women. And he's actually going to give a good explanation for that. So that's what we're reading here. Reading on, it says, marriage was the non-sacramental private acquisition of a woman by a man, and the state had little legal standing in that matter. The foreign woman who married an Israelite husband was supposed to leave her gods and her father's house, but even if she did, it never occurred to anyone to argue that her children were not Israelites. Because again, it was because of the man, his lineage, right? Because it's a patrilineal society. Reading on, it says, being a Judean can be compared to someone having a certain nationality determined by his or her father. As mentioned above, in the Hebrew Bible, a number of foreign women are mentioned. I will come back to the phenomenon of intermarriage in the 3rd chapter. And this is obvious. It's ostensibly in the Bible where you see that all the children of Ham is determined by the father, Ham. The children of Shem, determined by the father, Shem. Japheth. Going so on and so forth. The Ishmaelites created Ishmael created Ishmaelites. Jacob, his name was changed to Israel. He created Israelites. It's all determined by the father. Esau's name was changed to Edom. He created Edomites. So this culture is clear that it's patrilineal. It says here, around the 2nd century CE, the rabbis decided to switch to Jews. A Jew is someone whose mother is of the Jewish faith, leading to a matrilineal society. However, this is not a complete definition. A person who converted to Judaism was and still and is considered a Jew as well. In most cases, the reason for the conversion was probably intermarriage. And that's the number one way of conversion. A lot of people mention conversion. The number one way of conversion, as you said, in most cases, is intermarriage. Actually getting married to a Jew or whatnot, right? That's the number one form of conversion. As it says here, during this time, 2nd century, the Mishnah comes in and they come up with this idea of matrilineal descent. But initially, it was a paternal thing. It was a paternal culture. It says here, and not religion as such. Thus, the rabbis introduced a cultural religious community whose members did not necessarily have to originate from Canaan. They abandoned a system based on men and region and replaced it by a system based on women plus a non-measurable inflow of converts. It is not known why the rabbis switched to Jews. Cohen discusses the various reasons that have been proposed quite extensively, but he cannot provide a definite reason either. As mentioned on page 16, the reason may have to do with the upbringing of the young children by the women. The rabbinical ruling is applied in today's Israel as well. An interesting implication of the rabbinical ruling is that for the rabbis, religion is actually the only decisive factor. A Judean or Israelite origin plays no role anymore. So at this time, 2nd century, you can see a large ideological shift where they're allowing just the females to determine who a Jew or what a Jew is, who's considered a Jew, and also intermixture, admixture, and intermarriage, right? So it wasn't solely a paternal thing anymore during this time. It said it's not clear to what extent the rabbinical ruling prevented Jews who had remained in their homeland from marrying non-Jewish women. However, what happened when Judeans or Jews went to live abroad? There are no numerical data about people who converted to Judaism. The more than 100 foreign women and children mentioned above are no proof of conversion either. They are only proof of admixture. Why should these women have converted to the religion of their husbands if this was not an issue in those days? Only after the rabbinical ruling, the conversion becomes a prerequisite for marriage with a non-Jewish. Because Judeans started to migrate to other countries well before the rabbinical ruling, there may not have been an official conversion at all. In addition, the conversion took place mainly in the case of marriage after the rabbinical ruling had been implemented. So again, that's the number one source of conversion. Again, in rabbinical Judaism is marriage. I just have to keep reinforcing that because that's historically attested to. We have documentary evidence of this. We can actually prove this. It says, in such cases, there was no need to register such marriages because they were simply part of the ruling. It is thus virtually impossible to obtain numerical information about the extent of the conversion. We can get a much clearer idea about conversion / admixture by looking at the physical appearances, phenotypes of today's Jews in different regions. For example, Indian, Chinese, Ethiopian, and European Jews resemble non-Jewish Indian, Chinese, Ethiopian, and Europeans, respectively. The only conclusion that can be drawn is that admixture conversion must have been quite extensive. Interestingly, I did not find Jewish history scholars who point toward the obvious connection between admixture and phenotype. When humans migrate to other places, their progeny does not adopt the physical features of the autochthon population without massive admixture. Despite the phenotypic resemblance, Jewish geneticists do not consider European Jews as Europeans. On the other hand, colored Indian, Ethiopian Jews are considered descendants of converts. Why? Because again, white is white, black is black. We know how that works. But also, I want to point out and extrapolate and talk about what he said about admixture giving you the physical features of the autochthonous people. This can also be seen with the early E3A carriers, E1, B1A carriers. We know how they would look. They would look like the Kefians. They would look more akin to what Ramesses III looked like. He didn't have prognosticism. He wouldn't look like a typical Nigerian. He would not look like that, even though he's E1, B1A, until you mix with the autosomal admixture of the autochthonous people in Nigeria, like your the hunter-gatherer groups. And then you will get that look of what you call quote-unquote Negroid. So it's the same thing. A lot of the East European Jews look like that, look the way they look, because they came in and mixed with haplogroup K, which were European women, pick up the autosomes, pick up the phenotypes. You do that over generation upon generation. You're going to look like the surrounding population. It's just going to happen. It works like that. That's how genetics works. That's how autosomes work. Your children are going to pick up the autosomes and phenotypes of those women, right? So that's what he's explaining here. It says, thus, in order to differentiate between the differently defined Judeans and Jews, I use the term Judeans. For the period between 587 BC and the beginning of the Common Era, the term also agrees with the word the Greeks used. For example, the community of the Judeans. The same holds true for the Roman literature, for example, the uprising of the Judeans. The use of Judeans or Jews in the book has nothing to do with the cultural aspects involved. It only pertains to the composition of the group. The Romans considered Judeans and Jews as a cultural group because of their religion, but used the geographical name for both of them. A similar use of words is found in the Netherlands, where Dutch-born children of Moroccan immigrants are still called Moroccans by many people. The precise date of the switch from Judeans to Jews is not important. If the rabbinical ruling would have been accepted later, for example, in some remote areas, it would only have been easier for Judean/Jewish men in these areas to marry foreign women, as had been the custom for centuries. They would still be seen as belonging to a cultural group. The reason for the two terms is only the genetic aspects of the rabbinical switch, leading from geographically defined group to an ill-defined group. Ashkenazis. Let's get to the Ashkenazis. I'm going to end this chapter, and maybe tomorrow or Monday I will continue to read chapter 2 and maybe 3. But let me finish this chapter. It says, German Jews had specific rights. These rights became the official rights of European Jewry, excluding of the course of the Iberian, which is Sephardic Jews. As a result, Jews outside of Germany who follow Ashkenazi rites are called Ashkenazis as well. Thus, there are two kinds of Ashkenazis. Ashkenazi by descent, those whose ancestors originated from Germany, and Ashkenazi by rights, those whose ancestors came from somewhere else, for example, from Anatolia or Italy bypassing Germany. Jewish geneticists follow East European Jewish history scholars and treat Ashkenazi as a homogeneous genetic population. This is not so strange because most Ashkenazis live in the United States and Israel and are, for the most part, of East European origin. This has led to remarks about Ashkenazic genetic diseases, which are essentially East European diseases. For example, the Tay-Sachs disease. As I mentioned in an earlier publication, the TSD carrier frequency among Dutch Jews and probably also German Jews is not higher than that of non-Jewish Dutch or Germans. A relatively recent example of a publication that pulled Ashkenazic Jewry is the article by Guha et al. About health and diseases among Ashkenazis. Chapter 6, I will show that rabbis and possibly teachers of religion were responsible for taking the Ashkenazic rites to the Eastern Europe. It's not likely that a few common Jews who migrated from Western Europe eastward were able to make East European Jewry follow Ashkenazi rites. They were no authority, and they also lacked the knowledge to pass on all the laws pertaining to religious life. So let's get to the conclusions. Early Israelites appear around 1200 BCE. That's why a lot of times we have in arguments, debates, and dialogue, we tell people, hey, the Israelites are Iron Age people. They don't really become an ethnic component until the Iron Age, because it's around that time. 1200 BC, Iron 2A period is known as the Israelite period to the archaeologists, right? It says, so early Israelites appeared around 1200 BCE as nomads in the hills of Canaan and are possibly descendants of the Shasu and Aparu, two ethnically undefined groups. The population of Canaan between 1200 BCE and the beginning of the Common Era was ethnically heterogeneous. That just means different peoples. They weren't all the same. It says the northern kingdom of Israel consisted of Israelites and non-Israelite tribes that were indigenous to Canaan. We proved that through the fact that Assyrians were replacing the population. Not all Israelites were deported from northern Israel, but there were Israelites that were taken from northern Israel, and the Assyrians also placed people in northern Israel and gave it more heterogeneity, right? Made it more of a hodgepodge. They also did this to Judah as well. We read about the Babylonians taking the aristocracy of Judah, the rulership, the top echelon, so to speak, of the Jews were being taken during that time. It says the northern kingdom of Israel consists of Israelites and Israelite tribes that were indigenous to Canaan. The northern kingdom was much bigger, more populous, and much more powerful than the kingdom of Judah, especially during the dynasty of the Amorites. And that makes sense from a traditional standpoint. If you follow the Bible traditionally, the northern kingdom would have had more tribes, more people, more land allotment. So that's just common sense if you're using your noggin. It says the story of the 10 lost tribes is grossly exaggerated. Between roughly 70 to 90% of the population remain, which is true. Because of the widespread idolatry, intermarriage with non-Israelite tribes occurred. That is also true. It says, in addition to members of the 7 tribes, Israelites were not allowed to marry, but probably did. Intermarriage could also have taken place with Phoenicians, Midianites, Moabites, and Edomites. The rabbinical ruling that replaced Judaism based on the nationality of the father by Jews based on the religion of the mother plus converts became an additional reason for the inflow of foreign people, especially in the diaspora, shown clearly by the geographical determined appearances by a few in different parts of the world. And this is why you would see the modern Jewish population is a hodgepodge. There's haplogroup G, there's haplogroup Q, there's T, of course, we have E, we have J. It's so many. You got haplogroup A amongst them. There's so many markers amongst them because there's a large inflow of foreign people during this time, and they're pretty much snowballing within this cluster. It says additional reason for inflow of foreign people, especially in the diaspora, shown clearly by geographically determined appearances of Jews in different parts of the world. The rabbinical ruling in combination with the heterogeneity of the people of Judea is a disaster for a geneticist who tries to link modern Jews to a fixed group of Judeans or other before the beginning of the Common Era. There are 2 groups of Ashkenazis, descendants of German Jewry and descendants of Jews who follow Ashkenazic rites. So that's the conclusion of that chapter. And he does a conclusion after each chapter, which is a very great writing style. It's probably something I will copy when I eventually write my book. So when we come back, we will be diving into the history and demography of East European Jews according to the Bern-Wine hypothesis. This will be where we pick up next time we come on and discuss that. So again, I want more brothers and sisters to be knowledgeable of Ashkenazic history, because we always talk about in this Ashkenazic history and Ashkenazic peoples, you don't even know the history of it. And yes, I do believe that white Ashkenazis are actual Jews. I believe that European Jews are actual Jews. I believe that Mizrahis are actual Jews. They're no less Jews than anyone else. They have the history. They have the documentary evidence. They have the genetics to prove it. All right? So I'll catch you guys on the next episode. We'll be dealing with chapter 2, history and demography. What is demography? It's pretty much the study of people's migrations. That's pretty much what that is. The history and demography of East European Jews according to the Bern-Wine hypothesis. All right? Peace. We out of here, man. 7 gang, Source gang over everything. Y'all know how we rocking, man. Y'all know how we rocking. I appreciate every one of y'all coming through, showing me love. Hit that like button, share, and subscribe to the channel. You ain't got to like it, but you got to respect it, right? Let's get it. Let's get it, man. Stay tuned. We will be back. And we will finish this book in its entirety. And again, we're under the Copyright Act, so we're able to cover this material. here at the source for learning purposes, critiquing, and commentary purposes as well. All right. All right, let's get out of here.
Top of the line, nigga. Check. Excuse me, let me introduce me. Look, uptown, top of the line, HP. See, I'm $1 million nigga, Rolex on my wrist crush. Ain't too many could touch, baby, I'm too much. I'm 15 with 15 carats and 15 figures and 15 niggas and 15 hummers with triggers. I'm way at the top of the $1 million spot. When I flex what I got, make niggas sick like a drought. Every show I get, you can give me a quarter key. Tryna wholesale, but it costs $6.5 to see me. While we be doing shows, baby, transporting keys. Finding out all ways to beat the NOPD. But can't stop me from shining. No, can't stop my rollie from winding. Yeah, I blow niggas' mind. Man, prime up in the 5, dog is top of the line. Say,
Love, you need to have diamonds like me. Y'all need to see the leather in the Humvee. Us niggas 6 figures. Top of the line niggas. You need to have diamonds like me. Check the rack opinion in the Humvee. See me playing with 6 figures. How you love that top of the line niggas?
Nigga, I just ordered me something new. Some 6th generation technology that's only made for movies. Coming from Tennessee and I'm in Louisville on 23rd Street, hanging with this high boy chillin', trying to find a way to drop 100 keys on these niggas. And I peepin' this shit, they be shining like me, nigga. Riding on 20s, they be playing these hoes. These niggas in Louisville got a mouthful of gold. But see, Playboy, I be bout that shining. These niggas bout that rapping, while I be bout big timing, nigga. I'm so true to blue, whatever I do, I just bought new cars for the whole crew. I'm so top of the line, nigga, I don't know what to do. I bought fresh a Lamborghini, me a Lotus, fool.
I got the jacuzzi nigga in the back of the truck, running water for your daughter when she wanna get bucked. Cable, satellite dish, Sony remote. Benson sold me the truck, Coca sold me the book. I got some shit on my finger that'll blind the crowd. I got some shit in my truck that's way too loud. I'm the most looked back in the year 98. Y'all got to love me, baby. Don't I look great? God gave me the gift, so I'ma share it, y'all. Like Michael Jordan, y'all gon' see me ball.
1 million, 2 million, 3. Oh, it's my fault. Yeah, nigga with the go hard. Lexus automatic start. I shine like 18 and sparkle like a bezel. Riding up your block in the fully loaded Lexus. Play the navigator on road, but that's for tomorrow though. Shagging a 400 with Fat Julius and Mario. Yeah, slut, that's me in the GS3. So play the back seat, suck on the meat. Watch your teeth and wipe your feet before you step on the bell. Ding dong, rock your bell, work your meal, so what the hell? What? Like my smile? $3 million grin? What? This me, plain, introduce me to your friend. It's all gravy, baby. Hot boy, you should know it, and I'ma say this, baby. That's beautiful. Look, I'm large, bruh. Be flying up and down the lake on CVRs, bruh. In my garage, up at my place, I got 4 cars, bruh. I swear, me and my brothers be superstars, bruh. But look, it's marvelous, you see, I bloop. Bust like a bottom of wet. Go cash bout 4 checks, your wife twice get more wet. I sticks to the code, Reeboks and hit your bows. It's all about the mail, Bezos, diamonds and gold. Say,
Y'all niggas need to have diamonds like me. Check the wood grain in the